In the history of the Church, there have been two great saints who have been the apostles of the confessional. The first was St. John Vianney, who after the French Revolution, when the church in France was practically destroyed, brought people back to faith by being a faithful confessor. People from all over France and beyond came to be healed by him in the confessional. And the second great apostle of the confessional was Padre Pio Pietrelcina, who restored in our own day the real meaning of the sacrament of penance. Today I wish to speak about Padre Pio, who has described his own ministry in these words. He said, "I have a mission to save souls." And how do you save a soul? You save a soul by bringing them to God and letting them leave behind any of their faults and sins. It was the same method that John Vianney used. He attracted people from all over Italy and actually all over the world. They came to him in faith because they felt their confession would be special with him, because somehow he was different. He allowed people to really understand the meaning of confessional, but it was never easy for him to hear a confession. St. John Paul II, in the homily which he gave when he canonized him a saint, said he was a generous dispenser of the divine mercy, giving spiritual direction and especially in the administration of the sacrament of penance. Would that his example encourage priests today to carry with them the joy of this wonderful ministry, which is so important to the life of the Church. Unfortunately, we recognize today that reconciliation is not frequented as it once was in the life of the Church. If you're older, remember those long lines on Saturday afternoon. But the long lines are not really what we want. What we need are people to use the sacrament to help them on the way to sainthood. Sometimes we don't need long lines, we need better confessions. All the popes have told us, especially Pius XII, the greatest sin of the world today is that men have forgotten the sense of sin. People don't believe that they're sinning. They know they're not happy with things, but sin, well, I don't do anything wrong. Sometimes people come to confession and they keep telling you, well, I didn't murder anybody, I didn't steal anything, and it goes down the list of all the things they didn't do, horrible things that few people would do. But what are the sins that we have? Why are they hidden so deeply in our souls? If we do not recognize sin, neither will we recognize our need for forgiveness. Padre Pio understood this need. He spent many hours a day, sometimes 18 hours a day, hearing confessions. People had to line up and wait. There were long lines for his confessional. He once said, "I am overcome with the love of God and the love of neighbor." That's why he sacrificed himself so many times. In the pain that he suffered because of his stigmata, to spend those hours listening to the faithful and dispensing God's mercy. In a wonderful book entitled El Padre Saint Pio di Pietrelcina, it's in Italian, I read it recently, it describes his ministry of confession, and actually the priest who wrote it was with him during his time at the monastery there, and he went to find the people who went to confession to him. And from them, he learned what his method was, what he said. One person said his confession was like this: the language was sweet, cutting, frank, and mysterious. He attacked, he unearthed, and he upheld as Christ because Christ lived in him. He had that method, sweet, cutting, frank. He confronted people. He had that double message of love and vigor. He was not scrupulous, but he made sure that his penitents were well prepared for the absolution they would receive. It was his privilege to give absolution, he said, because of the sacrament of ordination. But from his own writings, we learn the principles he followed. He believed confession was a moment of real conversion. It was a radical change in people's life. Sometimes which forced him to withhold absolution. He did not deny absolution. He said, come back at another time. This was so the penitent could be better prepared to confess his sins and to have that firm purpose of amendment, which was so important in our confession. He once said, confession is a rebirth. It's a beginning to live the use of reason, taking responsibility for our own mistakes. The Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us that sorrow of a soul allows the soul to recognize the sins committed, accompanied by the desire to do no more sin. There's a saying among priests that to be a good confessor, we have to be good penitents. That means we too have to go to confession. We too have to examine ourselves, recognize our faults, and seek God's forgiveness, because then we will know how to give forgiveness to others in a way that is meaningful. This was so true of Padre Pio, who frequently went to confession. Many times, I'm sure at least once a week, sometimes more. He once said to a penitent, my son, sin is not only a transgression of God's law. Sin is above all a betrayal of love. We betray God's love when we sin. You know, we have many gifts that God gives us, and we don't appreciate them all. But as he said, I'm one of the greatest sinners on earth. He recognized his own faults, perhaps under a microscope, saw them bigger than they were, but he knew that was keeping him from a total love of God. The ministry made him really one with this penitence. He followed the law of the church and prepared people for confession. And first, if they did not accuse themselves of sin, if they were not prepared, he would tell them very crudely in Italian, va via, means scram, get out of here. Not a very nice way to say it. But they recognized that was a kind of an opening for them to say, well, what's going on? Why does he refuse me? And there always would be another priest by saying, don't forget, come back. Prepare yourself better. And that's when the people would come back, even though he was tough with them. He once said, we thank God that we have humility because certain defects we will take into paradise with us. That doesn't mean we're going to be free from all of our defects and faults when we die. We're going to take them to paradise. They were our steps to paradise, overcoming those faults and sins and difficulties. And better we understand why he postponed absolution, giving people a time to prepare better, to understand better their life and have that better amendment to say, this is how I think I can change my life, and doing it in a different way, in a better way, to come closer to God. He said, in every person there is Jesus, but in the sick person there is Jesus twice. And he took very much care of the sick, making sure that as a confessor, he also sometimes became a doctor. Many would come to him with the hope of their physical illnesses might be relieved. And he understood human suffering because he had suffering himself, being with the wounds of Christ that he bore in his life. We heard that in the second reading today. St. Paul did also, and so did he. So the physical suffering of others was very much important to him. In fact, he just didn't say, put up with your suffering, but he founded that great hospital in San Giovanni Rotondo, one of the best hospitals in all of southern Italy. He started it with one doctor and built it up. Donations came in, so it became one of the best hospitals, so people didn't have to go 200 miles to Rome. They could stay right there near their families and receive the best medical care. He understood that that was important. It was called the House of the Relieving of Human Suffering. So he knew we had to relieve human suffering. Even though all the time we suffer, we give it back to God. But suffering in itself has no meaning if we do not give it to the God And also, if we do not try to relieve it, we're not masochists. We don't suffer because we want to suffer, because it's something good. It's not good. But in its place, it has its reasons. There's no question that in the confessional, the Holy Spirit is very active. Sometimes it prompted Padre Pio to withhold absolution, but also gave him insights into people's lives. He could sometimes, when people couldn't really say what they wanted to say, would pull it out of them. It's like pulling a tooth, though. It's not very easy. If you extract the tooth yourself, you might be able to do it a little bit better. But if somebody else does it, it's more difficult. And that sometimes happens in confessions, that people just don't know how to get to the point of what they're trying to say. And it's difficult. One time I remember I was hearing confession in a jail, in a young people's jail. And this young guy said, I didn't go to confession since my first communion. You must have been about 18 years old, 17 or 18. And I said, well, okay, tell me what you're sorry for. And he turned around and said very sincerely, I'm sorry I'm here. So he didn't quite get the point. He wasn't sorry why he was there, he was sorry that he was here. And sometimes we're in that same boat. We don't realize, what are we to be sorry for? We're sorry that we're in this condition that we can't be happy, or that some sin is keeping us from seeing God in every day and seeing God in our fellow human beings. So we've got to go deeper sometimes and understand what motivates us. What do we do wrong? There's always something wrong. We're not perfect. We're not all saints. We're on the way to sainthood. So remember, the Holy Spirit is the one we encounter in confession. Yes, it is the Holy Spirit who is the power of that sacrament. The priest is only an instrument. The great instrument that Padre Pio was very much difficult at times for him. He said, in an effort at times to excuse the suffering caused by those who had to come back to confession, he said, it's true. I make the penitents shed blood, but my blood is mixed with theirs. Shed blood, really a difficult thing, but his own blood, his own suffering was mixed with theirs. When he postponed absolution, it was always with the purpose so that people would come back better prepared. St. John Paul II, again, in the homily he gave for the canonization of Padre Pio, he said, he treated pilgrims with apparent harshness, but it was only that he could understand the gravity of their sin and that they would be sincerely penitent. Almost always they came back to have a peaceful embrace with the sacrament of forgiveness. And by the way, it's generally known that John Paul II, when he was a priest, went to confession to Padre Pio, because he studied in Italy, Pope John Paul II. He went there, and Padre Pio told him, you will be the Pope someday. Now, that's not in any book, but it's the rumor that's out there, and it's probably true. Padre Pio knew the state of people and what would happen. It was something that never was taken lightly by him. He said, I need to work in confession. It's above all a labor. When I don't feel like doing it, it's a sacrifice. He also got tired sometimes. He was tired of listening all the time, but it was a sacrifice that made him more holy. The saint once said, on earth there's no justice, but there is mercy. But the sad thing is, he said, I can deal that there with justice or no justice, because in justice, I know that God will ask me to do penance to make up for what I did. But I can't deal with God's mercy, because that's beyond me. Why is God so merciful? Why is God going to forgive me and forget about what I did? That's what's really the heart of it. Mercy, God's mercy. That's what confession is about, receiving God's mercy. God forgives and forgets what we've done. There's no holding us to justice somehow to make up in the future. So we ask the Lord that our lives today become more like open books, when we go to confession especially, to put ourselves before God, who is the divine healer, And the priest is only the mere instrument of that healing process through the sacrament of ordination. We take to heart the instruction that we just heard from Padre Pio himself, from his own way of helping people make good confessions. But let's not forget, what's the purpose of confession? To come to the Eucharist. It's not just confession, it's that we participate in the Eucharist because this is our union in this world with God that we want in the world to come. It begins here in the Eucharist. That's the great gift we have. So let's offer today your communion that you will have the grace of a good confession when it's your time to go. But also pray for priests. They will have the gift that Padre Pio had, the gift of the Holy Spirit to hear confessions well so that people can be helped on the way to sanctity. Each one of us is charged that this pilgrimage of earth brings us to heaven, and we have to be prepared. We have to have our lives in order, and the Lord helps us do that with the great sacrament of penance and reconciliation.